Well, good morning to everyone in the Western Hemisphere. Good afternoon, good day to everyone in the Eastern Hemisphere. Welcome to another of the Middle East Institute's Thursday webinars. I am Ken Pollack. I am the Vice President for Policy here at the Middle East Institute. And today we're going to be talking about the negotiations surrounding the ending to the 12-day war, as I guess we're now calling it, the war between Israel and Iran. I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment. They're a phenomenal group. But before I do so, I want to remind everyone we are on the record for this session. We are live streaming it, and in addition, the recording will be available later on. For that reason, I do want to point out that it is 11 a.m. on Thursday, June 26th. So for those of you who may be watching this at a later point in time, please have some sympathy for our ignorance of the future. We don't yet know what all of you know, and we're simply operating under the circumstances of the moment that we're speaking. We will start out with a conversation. I'll take the different speakers through some main points that I think will be germane and interesting for everyone, but then you're welcome to ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function on Zoom. If you're not familiar with that, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will find a Q&A button located between the green share button and the show captions button. If you click on that Q&A button, it will bring up a dialog box. You can type your questions in there, and I will integrate those questions into our conversation as we move forward. Okay, now to our guests. We are tremendously pleased to be able to bring, I think, exactly the right group of people to have this conversation. First and foremost, Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Ambassador Crocker is quite simply the most accomplished diplomat of his generation, certainly with regard to the Middle East, but I would argue anywhere. He was our ambassador in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and I think he is well known to everyone in this group. He is also a distinguished diplomatic fellow of the Middle East Institute. Shalom Lipner is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. He is a highly regarded expert on Israel and served in the Israeli government, serving any number of different Israeli prime ministers, including at different points the current one. And finally, Mohsen Milani, who is a professor at the University of Florida and located at Tampa. I should have pointed out, Shalom is speaking to us from Jerusalem, Ryan from Spokane, Washington, Mohsen from Tampa. For anyone who knows Iran, you know the name Mohsen Milani. He is one of the most highly regarded experts on Iranian affairs, particularly Iranian politics, Iranian domestic affairs, and Iranian foreign policy. All of them are going to be speaking to us in their private capacity. Their remarks are entirely their own. And with that bit of introduction, let's dive into it. Mohsen, I'd like to start with you, and my plan is to I'll speak to Mohsen a little bit about the Iranian side, then I'm going to switch over to Shalom to talk about the Israeli side of things, and then finally I'm going to move to Ryan. He gets to bat cleanup and make sense of all of this and explain to us what the United States ought to be doing in these negotiations. But Mohsen, as I said, let me start with you. And what I'd like to ask you is give us a sense as best you can right now of where the Iranian government is with regard to this war and what you think primarily they're going to be looking for in these negotiations.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It is a great honor to be on a panel with two other distinguished guests of yours. Let me start by saying this, that what we are witnessing today is not the end of a story that started in 1979. It is the beginning of a new chapter in that saga. And I think it is important to put this whole thing in perspective in terms of how the Islamic Republic is reacting, what kind of analysis they have. And I have to tell you from the very beginning, I don't speak on behalf of anyone. I am a single academic. I speak on my behalf, the end of the story. I think the Islamic Republic has more or less come out of a shock. I always tell my friends that on September 10th, America was a disjointed society, highly polarized. Then September 11th, when the terrorists attacked the American homeland in a barbaric terrorist attack, America was disoriented. And on September 12th, the day after, America became unified. So the first great surprise for me as an analyst is that contrary to what perhaps some elements in Israel, some elements in the US government thought that by going after the top leadership of the Islamic Republic, they are going to create a shock. And that shock is going to cause the disintegration of this system. And then eventually the people are going to take to the streets. Of course, the main goal of the Israeli attack was to degrade the Iranian nuclear program. But I submit to you that what Israel did in Iran is no question a fantastic, phenomenal military and intelligence operation. No doubt about it. I haven't seen anything like it before. But that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is that I can't think of a single Middle Eastern government, not a single one, that could have withstood what Iran took and still being able to retaliate against Israel. That is equally as surprising to me as anything else. Another important point is that, which is going to determine how Iran is going to operate, is that if you look at the history of Iran, Iran usually responds very slowly. But once they get involved in a war, it's very difficult for them to get out of it. That's why I said this is the beginning of a new story. And today, maybe people who are listening to me have more information, classified information. I don't have access to that. All I can tell you, what we don't know about Iran's nuclear program is more than what we do know. And I think people have to be a little bit more cautious when they make judgment about the extensive damage. For example, we don't know where, at least I don't know where the stockpile of enriched uranium is. I don't know how effective Israel's assassination of Iran's nuclear scientists in the past 2 weeks have impacted the ability of Iran to reconstruct its damaged nuclear program. Damage, it definitely has been. We don't know if there are hidden areas where Iran has assembled its centrifuges. And most importantly, it is unclear whether Iran is going to decide to push toward weaponization or not. I think that all depends on what happens if the US and Iran decide to resume their negotiation.
So that's a great start, Mohsen, but I got to pick up on that point because, in many ways, for all of us, that's the $64,000 question. Do you think that there are circumstances? Let's imagine for a moment that the regime is open, not that they've decided, but that they're at least open to the idea of a negotiated end to this, a deal, rather than just going for breakout or even playing the negotiations to give them cover to go for breakout. But let's assume for a moment that they're at least open to the idea of real negotiations. What are their red lines going to be? Will they be willing to give up all enrichment activity? Are there other red lines for them?
That is an extremely important question. I don't have an answer for it. And I can tell you why I don't have an answer. Because I don't know how extensive the damage has been to Iran nuclear program. So they have to play their game very carefully. What I do know is that this idea of Iran surrendering, unless something huge happens in the next few days, and that can happen because war can, as you better than anyone else know, there is no computer modeling game that can tell you what happens once the war starts. I honestly don't know because I don't know the unknown, but what I can tell you is that as long as the Islamic Republic is there, they are going to try to try to go back to what they had. Now, just because you want to go back doesn't mean you can go back. But I think the logic, the strategic logic of Iranian regional policy, its approach toward Israel, its approach toward America is unlikely to change. Definitely not toward Israel, but I do see a possibility of some sort of modification of or reform of Iranian policy toward the United States. You know me, I have always said, and I'm going to repeat again, this policy of anti-Americanism, this policy of anti-Israel was a loser from the very beginning. In my new book, which was written before the fall of Assad, before Hezbollah was overthrown. And by the way, I used some of the fantastic ideas from Ambassador Crocker because I interviewed him for that book. My conclusion at that book was that Iranian regional policy is unsustainable. That yes, Iran has become a powerful force in the Middle East, but it cannot sustain it unless they come with some kind of agreement with the United States. And I stand by the same conclusion today.
That's great, Mohsen. And so first, you teased us there. Tell us the name of the book. It's brand new. We're going to have you back here at MEI come the fall, so you can talk about it some more. But then let's pivot and let's pick up on exactly what you're talking about, because again, there's more that we got to get at with the Iranians. Do you think that there are some compromises that they might be willing to make now that they weren't willing to make before the war started? And for instance, the Trump administration had proposed this idea of some kind of a regional consortium around enrichment, maybe do the enrichment outside of Iran. Do you think that the war has changed Iran's perspective enough that they might now be willing to agree to that in a way they weren't beforehand? So start with your book. Give us the full title. Let everybody be able to buy that on Amazon. And then tell us about compromises.
You just made me a millionaire. So I'm going to promote my book. Yes, it's called Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the United States in the Middle East. It addresses how Iranian-US relations shaped Iranian policy toward Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Israel and Palestinian resistance organizations. Now, going back to your question, yes, I do see this possibility, but my judgment, based on what I have seen, is that Iran is unlikely to agree to anything permanent at this time. I think the best we can do is to come out with some sort of interim agreement. And based on that interim agreement, then the two countries, the US and Iran, can later on, maybe a few months from now, agree to a more permanent one. But yes, I do see a lot of possibility, including the idea that you suggested, a consortium of sort in that area. But at this time, it is very unlikely that Iran is going to agree with zero enrichment. Even if they agree, I'm not very sure if this agreement is going to last for Iran.
Yes, that's a great point. And maybe later on, I'm guessing we'll get some questions and answers about the long-term prospects of the regime and Ayatollah Khamenei, great stuff. But before I turn to Shalom, I want to ask you one more question, which is carrots and sticks, right? Ways that the United States, the rest of the world could help incentivize this regime. Are there things out there? I mean, obviously, I think the prospect of the U.S. lifting sanctions is still on the table. President Trump seems to suggest as much. How important do you think that would be to the regime? And on the other end, potential sticks, reimposition of, there are additional sanctions or sanctions enforcement that the United States could implement, things that hadn't been done beforehand. And of course, there's also still the threat of renewed violence, renewed bombing of Iran. How do you judge the utility of the carrots and sticks going into these negotiations?
I think neither of those, neither is going to be the critical element for the Islamic Republic in the coming month. Because like any other regime, democratic or undemocratic. I always hear this cliche, oh, the Islamic Republic is only concerned about its survival. Would you please show me a country, a government that is not concerned about its survival? I mean, it's one of those ideas that we play around and makes absolutely no sense. But right now, the key for Iran, for the Islamic Republic, is consolidation of its position inside Iran. And nothing is going to stop them from A, trying to find out how Iranian intelligence was penetrated so deeply. B, they're going to find out what the hell is going on with its air defense system. What happened? They try to reconstitute it. Again, they try. Remember what I said, just because you're trying doesn't mean you're going to get it. And then I think they're going to start looking around. I think Iran is going to, unless we can come out with an agreement with the US, I think Iran is going to solidify its relation, consolidate at home, and consolidate its relationship with Russia, with China, and of course, internally, that consolidation means more repression. That consolidation means going after the Islamic Republic's opponents. If you go back to 1980, September 1980, and your book about the Iran-Iraq War is, of course, a classic, and you talk about it. Saddam Hussein did not expect the consolidation of the Islamic Revolution and that's exactly what happened. Now, I'm not suggesting that could happen, but I think that's the road, that's the path that the Islamic Republic is going to take. And therefore, I think what we are going to see, a combination of a more nationalistic sentiment in Iran, and we have already seen many evidence of that, and I'll be more than happy to talk about it later on. But that nationalistic sentiment, I think, is going to be coupled with more militarization and with the most hardline elements of the Islamic Republic gaining the upper hand.
All right. Not necessarily a hopeful, but a really important and interesting start to the conversation. Shalom, let me shift over to you. And let me start by asking you more or less the same question that I asked Mohsen. Where do you see the Israeli government right now going into these negotiations? How are they thinking about them? Is this good? And by the way, what's your sense? Was Bibi consulted? Was he asked about the ceasefire? Do you feel like does the Israeli government feel like it did what it wanted to do? And does it feel like it can get what it needs to get from the negotiations? Let's start there.
All right. So, well, first of all, good evening from Jerusalem. I was a little worried I was going to be doing this from a bomb shelter, but I think we're past that. And it's good to be on the Ken show. I don't want to be too argumentative off the top, but I almost challenge the premise of the question. I mean, obviously, because of the way things have unfolded, we're all wondering, where does Israel take this, having taken the first shot, at least in this round. But not wanting to cut into Ryan's lane too much, it's almost like, what's the American thinking on this thing? I think that, we have to take a step back and look how this thing is unfolded. I mean, we know where it started, but essentially, if we move forward towards the end of the 12 days, right? I mean, Israel sort of subcontracted the final blow to the United States. We've seen the United States rule the aftermath. Whether it was when Trump tweeted they called the pilots back on that strike after the last day, right? And all of a sudden, they diverted to other targets. And as Wilson said, also at the end of the day, I mean, inadvertently, or just as part of a sentence, it's like, then there's this negotiation process and the people at the table of the United States and Iran. So I mean, that matters. But there's another dynamic at work here. So I mean, on the one hand, Netanyahu was successful at bringing Trump to the table on this, but it kind of comes with strings attached. I don't think that this discovery of the limits of power is a new thing. I mean, Bibi tried to get the Obama administration to move away from the JCPOA. That didn't happen either. So I mean, it's not an unfamiliar situation, but that's kind of where we are. And we can and will talk about Israeli perspectives on this, but I think that at the end of the day, just like Iran, for similar and different reasons, at the same time, Israel has limited leverage over the process. I mean, a lot of this is going to be determined in terms of depending on how Washington decides to play this. You want to go with another question, or I should just
Yep.
keep talking?
No, I know you can, but yeah, uh, let me add on to that or
Yeah, sure.
direct you slightly. But those are great points. So recognizing exactly what you said, that Israel feels like it has limited ability to control this process. What's your sense of Israel's absolute must-haves and absolute can't-haves? What are the things it's got to get from this? What
Right.
does it feel are its red lines? Or else it feels like this thing was not just useless but counterproductive.
Right, right. I look, I think we have to contextualize a little bit, right? I mean, let's, remember, take a step back, right? Blocking the Iran's nuclear ambitions has basically been Netanyahu's signature issue for decades. He's been talking about this, nonstop. And effectively what happened is, now the stars aligned to bring us to where we are. We over it's not the first time that a strike was contemplated. It's obviously, people have been wondering to see how this whole situation would play out over the years. But here we have this convergence of, I guess, improved military intelligence capabilities over the years that had been collected. We have the downgrading of Iranian proxies in the region. We were watching and of defenses actually at home, for those two strikes last year. We have a president who has been more sympathetic to this than any other of his predecessors, despite all this years of discussion about not yes or no taking a military option off the table. I mean, clearly, Trump moved to the point where he greenlighted and even participated in this kind of thing. And then we have, the last day before we even had like the crowning moment of that IAEA report, finding Iran in violation. So the reason I lay it out that way is because I think that it's important to understand from the Israeli perspective, it's almost like a once in a lifetime shot, right? There's not People are not necessarily thinking about red lines and compromises. There's almost like a cautious euphoria here in a sense, right? And it's a question of like, how do you consolidate those gains, right? It's like there are a whole series of issues in play, and we'll talk about those. And that's not to say, obviously, their initial positions and they're where these things go later. But like right now, people are not showing a lot of leg, right? I mean, people are feeling the government is feeling semi-triumphant on this thing. I think very cognizant of the fact that it could go sour, if not today, down in the future. But nonetheless, how do you leverage where we are right now to like come out of this on with the best foot possible, right? Back to you or back to me?
I'm glad to pick up. Let
Yeah,
me ask a follow-up to what you just
sure,
said.
sure.
Um, is there, yeah, and look, a lot of Americans are very concerned about this. I think a lot of different people are concerned about this. Is there a moment that you can think of where the Netanyahu government decides this is not going in the direction that we want it to? We need to start bombing again. Do you think that's in the realm of the possible? And if so, what do you think might trigger that?
Yeah. So obviously it's in the realm of the possible. I would argue it's in the realm of the possible for the United States as well. I think that, you know, it's always a question how these dynamics play out. I think that the part of the fear always is, Ariel Sharon always just talk about the corrals, right? Like, like once you sort of end up in the situation, it's hard to sort of like back out of it once you've been corralled into a situation. So, you look at this and you go, we're in this moment now, and the talking will start, and everybody is there's always this question of like, we can do this, and certainly as long as the Iranian airspace is like Swiss cheese, right? Arguably, the Israeli Air Force could go back and do that sort of thing, right? But at least in the initial phases, that's very touchy, right? Who wants to be the person who's responsible for scuttling any progress on this thing? How does that look like? How long do you wait? What are the triggers for that sort of thing? So I don't think it can be ruled out, but I don't think it'll necessarily happen tomorrow, right? I think that if only because all the sides will be very cautious at this initial stage in this game of chicken, right? To like not be the person who provokes that and bring down hellfire upon them. Um, to talk about the specifics a little more, look, I think that Israel's always pointed to a lot of different issues on this thing, primarily the nuclear program, right? Um, what's being touted here often is they talk of the Libyan model, of like full dismantlement of the program, leaving aside what is or isn't realistic in terms of like what's on the table, right? So there's that discussion of dismantling the program entirely. There's attention to the ballistic missile development on that kind of thing. Does that capacity maintained? Part of the discourse over the years has also been and continues to be what people refer to as Iran's malign influence in the region, global terrorism, issues like that. So those are all pieces of the puzzle that Israeli officials will be looking at. I mean, I guess part of what, to your question, part of what will happen in terms of red lines will be, there's a kind of a pecking order there, like a hierarchy, that might in some way overlay with the American sense as well, even though we'll discuss that further too. I assume sort of mixed messaging is coming out of Washington, but at least some of the time, it's been said by some of the principals that, this is just about the nuclear program. So I think that's at the top of everybody's list. Maybe there'll be trade-offs on the other issues depending on how tight the end state of this kind of thing is when we get to it in terms of whether or not those other things are addressed. But I mean, there's a broader conversation here. We're not even talking about the elephant in the room and regime issues right now. But those are the primaries. I think that's the kind of stuff that we'll be looking at here. And again, and we can expand on that as well. I mean, there's this sense of like, where does Israel stand on this vis-a-vis the United States? Not necessarily in terms of its own red lines, but in terms of things that will be able to, shall we say, market the administration that they will be bringing to the table, arguably on its behalf.
Okay, so Shalom, I want to go back to a point that you just made a moment ago, 2 points that you just made a moment ago that I think are important. One, you seem to suggest that regime change was not a determined Israeli goal, right? It might be nice to have, but that's not going to be something that they're absolutely determined, that Israel's determined to get. And it's really about the nuclear program. So yes, again, Israel would love to have more stuff about Iranian behavior in the region and ballistic missiles, etc. But it's really about the nuclear program. That's where the real red lines lie. Have I got that right?
Well, I mean, I think that's what provoked what we've seen right now, and I think that it's been there was this internal back and forth going on about regime change issues, shall we say, and the government did not formally determine that as a goal of this operation, and then as happened with the president himself, right? At certain points of the of this past couple of weeks, people got ahead of themselves, got ahead of their skis here, and hubris went to people's heads, and they started throwing around, well, that would be an interesting idea, and flirting with the idea. It's clearly enticing in the level to sort of connected to what the Muslim was saying in terms of the longer term. Also, I mean, there's this larger question about the degree to which we can expect this thing to be moved towards resolution as long as the landscape looks like it is, right? I mean, these are the people in power and the systems that we're dealing with. Then maybe there is a limited upside to this thing, which is why people are obviously attracted to that happening. I think also, though, at the same time, aside from not wanting to get ahead of anybody, so look, there's always hopefully at least cooler heads understand this as well. There's a way these things happen, right? I mean, I think people understand it would be a mistake, and we've all seen this in the experience of very many countries about when this is something that people try to engineer from the outside. What was interesting, I think, whether it was deliberate or not, towards the end of the campaign, I think we saw some of these strikes against, the Basij and, against Evan prison, that sort of thing. And people were sort of saying, is that tied to? Well, I don't know. You could come up with multiple philosophies on why that might have happened. But those sorts of things open interesting doors to what might happen within Iranian society. But I don't think, that's where this campaign was directed. And directly to your question, in terms of things that people will be putting on the table when we reach a stage of what is a negotiated settlement, an interim agreement, whatever it is, look like, what are the priorities and what are other things that, may not be addressed to Israel's full satisfaction at this stage of the game.
All right. So many things I'd like to ask you, but I want to bring in Ryan at this point in time. Ryan, I know I set you up, but you were willing to do this, and I so appreciate it. Let's start here. Go and please think about it more as Ryan Crocker. Let's not try to channel the administration just yet. We can do that later. But given obviously you've been following this closely, you've heard what Mohsen has said and what Shalom has said. Tell us how you would start this process. What would you be thinking about in terms of how the United States should conduct these negotiations and what we should be looking to achieve?
Well, as we've heard now from Mohsen and Shalom, I think it'd be obvious to any listener that this is a piece of cake. We could have it done in one day. What Well, look, I was struck by many wise things that both Mohsen and Shalom said. One thing Mohsen said right off the bat that impressed me was, this is not a new book. This is another chapter in a very long book. It is a very different chapter because, again, a barrier has been breached. We all spent endless amounts of time speculating on the consequences of an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities and the Armageddon it might bring, particularly if we're accompanied by an American strike. Well, that has happened. Yet the world still stands, and life goes on. Now what? The ceasefire was basically imposed by the Americans, by Trump, on Iran and Israel. There were no conditions. There were no understandings that I'm aware of what would underpin a ceasefire. It was just a ceasefire. And that means we now go, as we went from politics to war, back to politics. It's an inevitable progression. The first thing that we have to figure out is, what are the bottom lines here? And I would, if I were trying to set up a negotiation now, I would start, frankly, in Jerusalem. What are the Israeli bottom lines? Shalom alluded to some possibilities. What didn't happen in this campaign, of course, was any effort to eliminate the civilian leadership of Iran, starting with the supreme leader. That presumably is on the table. So to what extent, what does Israel need to see that would satisfy the Israeli state that Iran is not reconstituting a nuclear weapons threat? And what is it prepared to do at what point? So the first thing I would do is I would try to get to an understanding with our Israeli allies as to what their assessments are, what their bottom line is. Without that, it's hard to deal with an adversary. But then you've got to deal with that adversary. And here I think one interesting sidebar of the conflict was the reports of direct telephone conversations between Steve Witkoff and Arakchi. The talks thus far with the Iranians have been proximity talks, not in the same room at the same time. There was apparently some direct incidental contact, but these phone conversations may indicate that there is the possibility of direct contact. So once we have some clarity in our own minds on what Israel's bottom lines are, what it is prepared to do, what it is not prepared to do, and when it might be thinking of doing it, we need to get back to the table with the Iranians. And I would certainly push for direct contact. That's not going to happen right off the bat, clearly, but and it may not happen between Witkoff and Arakchi, even on the margins, at least in an initial stage. But boy, I would want some really good diplomats on that negotiating team for the United States. Individuals who know Iran, who know Farsi, and look for opportunities for some sidebar conversations with Iranian counterparts in the corridors. There is nothing like personal contact. That's what diplomacy is all about, ultimately. And I would look for an opportunity to start that, because just as we need to have an understanding of what Israel's bottom lines are, we've got to try a much harder conundrum, which is what Iran's bottom lines are. You pose that question. Will they accept zero enrichment under any circumstances? Mohsen casts grave doubt on that. Where I would start would be first ensuring that they don't make the cataclysmic step of withdrawing from the NPT. The second thing I would do would be to try to persuade them that it is in their own best interest to reestablish relations with the IAEA. to allow inspectors back in. They say that there is no nuclear weapons intent. Well, it's time to open up the books here. And that starts with IAEA. Because again, we in Israel have a powerful club, literally, that if we decide that they are not being transparent, that they are pursuing a nuclear weapons program, it's going to be bombs away again. So that may adjust, if not the strategic thinking in Tehran, at least the tactical thinking. So I would try to get an agreement from Iran to resume cooperation with IAEA. Then I would propose some creative thinking on enrichment options. We have floated the idea of offshore enrichment. Well, if you wanted to be really creative, you could float a site for that offshore enrichment, like bring in the United Arab Emirates as a party to an enrichment agreement for the region, and site a facility on, say, those 3 islands out there in the Gulf that used to be part of the UAE that Iran occupied in 1970. Just toss that out there. See if you can get some interest in the region and, of course, in Iran. But ultimately, I would say, again, going back to the Clausewitzian point that war emerges from politics, and to politics it must return. That, and this also goes back to Mohsen's point, we are not going to bomb our way into regime change. If there is a second round, we may see the annihilation of the civilian leadership of Iran, but that does not constitute regime change. And again, going back to one of Mohsen's points, what we are likely to see if there is a departure in the way Iran is governed, that it is going to be to the right, not to the left, not toward moderation, but towards more militarization and extremism. So that is the challenge in front of us, which is immense, but those are the points I would start with.
It's outstanding, Ryan. And I just hope someone is copying all this down and sending it to Steve Witkoff. In fact, maybe we'll send him the link later on. I wanted to tease out something a little more that you've alluded to, but Mohsen talked about it. It was a little bit even in what Shalom was saying, but this issue of regime change, right? Because what I heard from Mohsen, maybe correct me if you didn't hear it, and Mohsen, feel free to say no, you're wrong. But what I heard from Mohsen was that obviously the threat of regime change is out there. The regime is aware of it, right? And it could be a useful tool, as you're suggesting, Ryan. But by the same token, pushing too hard on that could absolutely backfire on us, right? That was one of the most important points I thought that Mohsen made. And so how do we kind of thread the needle, right? This is where we need incredibly skillful diplomats, but how do we thread the needle of maybe being able to use the threat of regime change or a regime change oriented bombing campaign, whether by us or by the Israelis, but also, not push the regime into thinking that these negotiations are a sham, that they're a cover for a regime change campaign, that the threat of regime change just drives them out of the negotiations.
Well, in my experience, negotiations and diplomacy in general are often characterized by what is not said as much as by what is said. Trust me, the Iranian leadership is very aware of the regime change potential. And Mohsen alluded to, I think, an important point. Clearly, an part of the Iranian after-action agenda is trying to figure out how the Israelis so penetrated the Iranian system that they were able to carry out those targeted assassinations. And that will be interesting to watch. Khamenei himself must know that there was every chance that there was a big red X on his back, but that the Israelis didn't pull the trigger. So I don't think that there is anything to be gained and a great deal potentially to be lost by threatening regime change. And let me just, again, not regime change. That is not in the cards. I agree with Mohsen on this. A leadership change. The Israelis know it's out there. The Iranians certainly know it's out there. We know it's out there. Um, so I would not have that as a talking point at all. Um, so, but I go back to my earlier point. I think it's very important that we come to some understandings with the Israelis sooner rather than later, before we engage again with the Iranians as to what their strategic thinking is, what their bottom lines and red lines are. I don't really know at this point. And I found Shalom's remarks to be quite enlightening in that regard, that it may not be that Israel is committed to civilian leadership change. That would be a nice ambiguity to have out there, but that is not an ambiguity that should exist between Israel and the US. We need to get clarity on that point.
That's a great one. And yeah, I wanted to pick up on that as well, and pick up some of the other points that Shalom made, because what I found intriguing, and again, feel free to disagree with me, and Shalom, feel free to raise your hands and scream that I have no idea what I'm talking about. I completely misheard you. But what I got was a lot of ambiguity, uncertainty on the Israeli side as well. That, clear end states may not necessarily have been defined. Yes, needs to be an end to the nuclear program, but not complete clarity on exactly what even that might mean, right? And not clear to go beyond that. Shalom, do you disagree with that? I see you.
Yeah, that's the point where I raise my hands and scream. No, I think that more than I'm suggesting is ambiguity on the Israeli part. I think it's on the American part. I think that's where it's become complicated. And to the extent that Washington, that's a little bit frustrating, right? I mean, we saw, the earlier Witkoff interview where he talked about the 3.6 for 7% threshold, right? And then we saw discussion, yes or no civilian energy. Then there was no enrichment altogether. Then there was talk of the consortium. I mean, I guess part of the confusion is that, and maybe this doesn't happen in more disciplined administrations, but like all the quiet parts are being said out loud. So, it's kind of hard to know exactly where they are on this. I mean, on these, especially on like enrichment issues and on the nuclear program, I mean, I think Israel's been like a steel wall in that respect. It's like, that's not happening. And to tie it into what I said earlier, we didn't go through this whole business now to end up at a point, where we're going to have the same problem again in the foreseeable future, or where we're talking about terms of deals in the past that were rejected or not rejected, that Israel didn't like in the first place. I think that whether it was a talking point or reality, right? I mean, even then Netanyahu was talking about, deals saying you have to be, fixed or nixed, right? So I mean, like there was this sort of this acceptance of the fact that, that it moves towards a deal, that there is something to talk about. I think that for better and worse, and this goes to some of the other points here that were made. I mean, I think that what will ultimately happen in terms of, protocols for monitoring and enforcement and issues like that, and how it ties to the peace of the regime is, you can hope that you have a deal that restricts their ability to maybe act on that will, but I don't know if you can change, sort of the will of the regime by like, having this deal that says like, now you're not allowed to want to destroy Israel anymore, right? I mean, what the deal is going to be out is making sure that they can do it, even though they still want to, right? So it's a question how easily, right? I think there's a lot of confusion. We see this also, like, I said also the regime change piece also, right? I mean, I think that the Secretary of Defense had that press conference where he talked about, no, we're in this for one thing, and the nuclear piece. The next day, the president started, playing with regime change in his social account. So I mean, again, there's a lot. You're not, thankfully, on the critical issues, you're not getting that kind of dissonance out of Israel right now. But conversations between the government in Jerusalem and the administration in Washington must be very interesting. And hopefully there, people are actually getting to brass tacks and deciding what it is that's important and how they're going to move towards that. Because from the outside, it looks much more chaotic.
So, Ryan, I want you to pick up on that. And I'd love your reaction to what Shalom said generally, but a couple of points in particular love to have you address. One is Shalom's point that this is an administration that frequently says the quiet parts out loud, right? And how problematic is that? I mean, that the Trump administration, the president would say that, it's really important that the Iranians hear this, or that the Israelis hear this, or the American people, or the whole world. Where do you come down on that? And then I want to push it a step further, which is, what we have seen is there do seem to be some important differences between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government in terms of end states and what would be acceptable to them. And, I think a critical question going into this, and you touched on this in some of your earlier remarks, how important is it that we are in lockstep with Israel? Or, if there are differences out there, how would we go about, trying to move the Netanyahu government to come around to what we think would be a reasonable end state?
That is why I would suggest that the administration start a negotiating process in Jerusalem. You would enjoin me at the outset not to indulge in lascivious speculation on what the Trump administration might or might not do, but Shalom forces the case. We have an inherently unpredictable administration because we have an inherently unpredictable president. And I would say, in terms of the negotiation itself, Steve Witkoff has one indispensable quality. He seems to have the trust and confidence of the president, because no negotiation goes anywhere if your chief negotiator is not aligned with his ultimate boss. And it seems that Witkoff and Trump are aligned. That may mean some unpredictability at the negotiating level, but that reflects reality of this administration. So what is our bottom line? I would be a little bit concerned, frankly, and I'd be very interested in Shalom's take on this. And at one level, Trump has done what no American president has ever done before, has gone to war directly with Israel against a common adversary. And that, I think, does create a well-deserved sense of euphoria in Israel. But on the other hand, I was struck by Trump's tone on Tuesday, in which he basically seemed to equate Iran and Israel. That
Right.
these countries need to knock it off. I would be a little bit concerned, I think, if I were an Israeli, over the depth of Trump's ideological commitment to the state of Israel. And that is something else that I think needs to get hammered out between Washington and Jerusalem before we seriously engage with Iran.
Okay. Shlomo, I will come to you for your reaction in a second, but Mohsen had a point that he wanted to make. So Mohsen, jump in here.
Yes, I just want to make a few observations about this notion of regime change. There is a Turkish proverb that goes something like this: your friend always tells you the consequences of the action you're about to take, but your enemy always tell you, I wanted to tell you what could happen, but they never do. So I think it is important to learn from Iraq and other experiences by asking this political question. What if the Islamic Republic collapses? Do you think we're going to have more stability in Iran or less stability? And it is in that context that I want to make just a couple of important points. Number one, this idea of going after the top leadership, as I said, Iran didn't collapse the way Hezbollah collapsed. So the question is why? And the answer is that for all these years, we've made one fundamental mistake about the nature of the Islamic Republic. We thought it is a one-man show. It is not. There are multiple centers of power. And even if you get rid of one, it is highly likely that another center can emerge. I think that should be given a great deal of thought to. The second issue, I talked about this nationalistic sentiment surge in Iran, but there is more to it than just nationalism. The question is, why have people been so quiet? And I think one of the reasons is because Iranians are very afraid of Iran going through what Iraq went through, what Afghanistan went through, and Syria went through. They are unwilling to take a big risk unless they know the transition is going to be peaceful. That is why they did not take it to the streets. Iranian middle class has been quiet. And without that Iranian middle class, I think it is very unlikely to see a radical change. So I think we need to ask, imagine you overthrow the Islamic Republic. By the most conservative estimate I've heard, there are about 800,000 armed men in Iran today, from the Revolutionary Guard and the Islamic Army. Do you really think they're going to collapse and they're going to go away? They are connected to the region and they're going to come back. And Iran is not going to be as stable as a lot of people think it is going to be. I could be completely wrong, and I'm not suggesting that this is what is going to happen. All I'm suggesting that I know General Petraeus, that you know, and I've had the pleasure of talking with him. He always used to say, tell me your exit plan when you want me to attack another country. Now, I follow his suggestion and tell me your exit plan for regime change. That's all I have to say.
Those are great points, Mohsen. All right, we're down to about 9 minutes. Shalom, I want to give you a chance to respond as well. But then I've got at least one more question, Ryan. I actually like to put a couple more questions because we're getting some great questions from the audience. But Shalom, go ahead with any thoughts you have in response to Ryan's or
Yeah,
Mohsen.
look, I mean, yeah, volatility is part and parcel of this president. I mean, it does, swing both ways. I don't think, anybody can be sure. It's sort of like the ebb and tide. People are like, oh, look, he's totally on side. And then the next day he'll do something like that. So, you want to be able to point to that line of his when he was asked if he was going to actually go through with this mission. He said, I won't know until the actual moment when it happens. And I think, in a lot of cases we see that. I would even point just to today's news. I mean, like two things that are playing out over here in the past few hours, right? The first thing was that whole stream of consciousness from the president this morning inveighing against the prosecution of the prime minister, and everybody's busy speculating about what that was or wasn't all about, leaving aside issues of propriety. There was also, I picked up a news story about an hour ago, apparently, which and we didn't talk about this at all, and maybe in the questions, I don't know, but the whole regional aspect of this piece as well. And like, there are suggestions out there that in the phone call between the two of them after the attack, there was this discussion of, now that we're through that, we're going to finish Gaza in a couple of weeks and move on to expansion of the Abraham Accords. I mean, that's something that's been hanging out there in the ether for a long time. Is it credible? Is it not? It opens the door on all kinds of other domestic political questions, which if we want to, we can get into, and what that sort of looks like as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that we've all become accustomed, if kicking and screaming, it's the perfect analogy in this case, to this sort of like behavior. And I think that everyone's trying to like, be on the watch for like when all of a sudden the it turns against you, and like when you can actually catch the wave and ride it. But it makes for a very complicated diplomacy.
Yep, perfect. Those are great points because these are exactly the questions that I want to put to you guys. So first, Ryan, exactly as Shalom has pointed out, we've got a whole bunch of questions from people about the regional role. So 2-3 minutes, but the GCC states, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, right? Everybody wants to know, should they be given a seat at the table? Do they need to be part of this? I'm thinking of Winston Churchill's great remark that the only thing worse than going to war with allies is going to war without them. Does it complicate the negotiations? Do they need to be part of it? And then I want to put the other points that Shalom mentioned to both Shalom and Mohsen quickly. About the other parts of the deal. But Ryan, first, the region, what role should it have in the negotiations?
Well, it's helpful to remember that the president started off his international travel in his second term with a visit to the region, to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to the UAE, not significantly to Israel, and clearly built up some goodwill. And I think that goodwill is very much still there, maybe even expanded, for all of the trepidation and distaste that Arab states, including the Gulf states, expressed for the Israeli campaign against Iran. We can't kid ourselves here. There was a lot of quiet high-fiving going on in the back rooms. And I think that the Iranian retaliation as choreographed as it was a reminder in Arab capitals that while Iran's ability to inflict damage on Israel may be limited and on the US non-existent, they can do a hell of a lot of damage in the neighborhood. So I think we very much should be in a negotiating strategy consulting with our Arab friends, particularly in the Gulf. And we've already seen, of course, the role that Qatar played in bringing about the ceasefire. I would expand on that. What opportunities do the Gulf states in particular see for a negotiated settlement on Iran's nuclear enrichment that will remove the nuclear weapons threat from the region and also remove the danger of further military action on the part of Israel and the US? So again, I mentioned the perhaps lunatic notion of proposing an enrichment facility on the 3 islands of the UAE that Iran occupied. But there is a lot to be discussed. And there is a sidebar to that, as Shalom indicated. This can also be a means indirectly of expanding the Abraham Accords. But all of that argues for intense engagement on the Arab side of the Gulf, as well as with Iran directly and with Israel.
That's great, Ryan. Okay, we've got 4 minutes left. And the question I want to put to both Shalom and Mohsen, we'll start with Mohsen, is this issue of Iran's support to its regional proxies and its allies. Is that something that you think the regime would even countenance? Could that be part of these negotiations? And then to Shalom, how important is it for Israel to have that as part of the negotiations? So Mohsen, you got 2 minutes. What do you think the regime thinks?
Yes, but let me just make one point about the 3 islands. I think it is clear that United Arab Emirates, which was established in 1971, never had the control of the 3 islands. It was dispute between the British and the Iranians. And I don't think the word occupied is correct. Iran recaptured what it had from the very beginning, but then the British had control. That's where I have to disagree with our distinguished ambassador. But going back to your question of how Iran is likely to respond about its regional allies, I think at this time we have enough problem with Iran's nuclear program, with its missile program, and I think it would be a waste of time for the negotiators to focus on something that we all know has been weakened. Iran is not going to abandon its support, but it's not the axis of resistance cannot play the kind of role it did prior to Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel. That's a fact. And therefore, why waste your energy? Why waste your capital talking about things that we can talk about later on? The focus has to be on nuclear issue. And then once we come out with an agreement, interim agreement, then other issues can be discussed. And don't forget the element of trust. Whatever you want to say about the Islamic regime, say it, good, bad, whatever. That it was the US who got out of the JCPOA. And don't forget, Israel attacked Iran while Iran was negotiating with the United States. So there is that element of lack of trust, and I hope they can build on confidence and take measures to push the 2 countries towards some kind of agreement as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Mohsen, and I'm so glad that you made it there. All right, Shalom, 2 minutes. How important are the regional dimensions for the negotiations for Israel?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't by mistake that I sort of enumerated them in that order, right? I mean, I think, after the nuclear and then the ballistic piece, I mean, obviously any residual issue there, it's not, I wouldn't say it's not of any concern, certainly if like people are actually hurt as a result of it. But I mean, obviously we're somewhere very different today than in the past after, the beepers and the walkie-talkies and after all kinds of other things that happen in the region. So I mean, like, the ability for that axis to inflict damage is not the same place it was in the past. There's continued concern, I think, about the possibility, not in the immediate neighborhood, but of like, what might happen, to Israeli access to Jewish communities around the world as a result of that kind of thing that are more exposed. I mean, if we're looking at that kind of question. So that's an issue. I don't see that necessarily as like a core, piece of that negotiation. To try and end on an up note, I guess. I mean, I would actually like try and, jujitsu that regional piece and say, going earlier, if the president has built this goodwill, and we have to take note of the fact that, despite the fact that we've just been through not just the past 12 days, but the past 600 plus days, since Gaza, and the accords remain intact, more or less. And there's still talk, louder and less loud sometimes, of like, potential, candidates to sign on in the future. And maybe there is some truth to the prime minister dashing for the exits on Gaza now, which would clear the path for MBS and other people that have been a little bit more restrained on that. So, I mean, I want to look at the regional aspect, not necessarily as part of that Iran negotiation, but as maybe a potential upside for where we might find ourselves in the not too distant future.
That's wonderful. All right. I have two wishes coming out of this. So first, I wish that we could keep talking for another 3 hours, because I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, but you've given all of us so much to think about. I think everybody on this in this session just has a completely different perspective on these negotiations as a result of everything you said. And for that reason, my other wish is that the Trump administration is listening. And for those of you who are part of our audience and part of the U.S. government, please do, try to get this to your bosses as fast as you can, because I thought there were any number of absolutely fantastic points made. Mohsen, Shalom, Ryan, thank you for taking the time to help all of us think through this incredibly important issue. I think it was absolutely invaluable. And for those of you at home, we're going to be taking July 3rd off to celebrate our Independence Day. But thank you all very much for joining us. And again, thank you, Mohsen, Shalom, Ryan.